Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here among such a distinguished group of speakers. As biohackers, you probably know that when you're exposed to certain stimuli affects your health. Maybe you try to minimize your exposure to artificial light at night, for example. I'm going to speak to you about why the timing of your diet is also important. In short, the timing of your body's clock influences what it ends up doing with the foods and drinks you consume. But what and when you eat also influences the function of your body's clock. So it's not only what you eat that matters, when you eat is important too, and this has critical health consequences. And I'm going to speak to you about what you can do to optimize your diet timing. But before we get there, I first want to frame our lifestyles in the context of the history of our species. Simplistically, humans once lived by two clocks. One of these was an environmental clock, predictable changes in factors such as light and temperature. In response to these changes, organisms evolved their own biological clocks to anticipate and adapt to these cycles, optimizing biology and hence behavior according to time of day. The biological clocks of our distant ancestors were probably tightly synchronized with the environmental clock. These people would have been physically active during the daytime to gather food and water, and at night, with light only coming from firelight, starlight, and moonlight, these people would have mostly rested and fasted. But then things changed in the blink of an evolutionary eye. And this is important because it takes time for evolution to select for genetic variants that help organisms pass on their genes. And this means that we're probably not well adapted to our current environments. Edison invented the incandescent light bulb in 1879. And this not only directly disrupted people's bodies' clocks, but it also enabled waking behaviors such as eating and physical activity at times at which people's bodies' clocks were promoting sleep. Coupled with advances in food refrigeration and transportation, human cycles of rest and activity and fasting and feeding were distorted. People could work round the clock, and a 24/7 society was born. A third clock influenced our lives more and more, the social clock. Shift work is an obvious example of the perils of living against our biological clocks. In 2011, about 12% of working Canadians worked either regular or rotating night shifts. The problem is that shift work is associated with increased risk of various diseases, such as diabetes, obesity, coronary heart disease, and stroke. Then there are the people that live with these shift workers, so-called second-hand shift workers, who are also at increased risk of clock disruption. But so too are the rest of us during instances such as jet lag, and many of you will be familiar with that this week. Then there are people who live at high latitudes, and residence in polar regions is associated with increased risk of various ailments, such as seasonal affective disorder. And a critical point is that careful experiments have shown that experimental disruption of somebody's body clock results in rapid deterioration in cognitive function and increased risk of various cardiometabolic diseases. Fortunately, we can do something about all of this if we understand how our clocks are regulated. These are regulated by the circadian system. This is a network of different types of clocks in our bodies, and it produces circadian rhythms, roughly 24-hour changes in our biology and hence behavior. What's interesting is that were we all to go live deep in a cave for several days without knowledge of time of day or exposure to light, then we'd find that on average, our clocks aren't exactly 24 hours. They're about 24 hours and 15 minutes. And what this means is that we need to reset our clocks each day. Interestingly, every cell in your bodies has its own clock. And the purpose of these cellular clocks is to temporarily separate the timing of incompatible processes, such as building new structures and breaking down damaged ones. We have a master clock in our brains, and this helps coordinate the timing of the clocks in the billions of cells elsewhere in your body. We spend about 36% of our lives sleeping, and the master clock is the main determinant of our sleep timing. The timing of the master clock is primarily set by light exposure. Light enters the eyes, where it's detected by specialized cells. These cells then relay electrical information about light exposure down the optic nerves, and the master clock sits above where these nerves cross, sampling this information to update a running record of your light exposure history. During darkness, this signal no longer comes in, and the master clock relays this back to a place called the pineal gland, where melatonin is synthesized. Melatonin then circulates throughout your bodies and signals the biological nighttime. That's a really important point. Melatonin high, biological nighttime. It acts on its receptors to tell cells elsewhere to do their nighttime jobs. And as an example of this, melatonin seems to reduce insulin secretion by the pancreatic beta cells in response to glucose. The biological nighttime begins about 2 hours before sleep onset, and because melatonin worsens insulin sensitivity, I suggest that you don't eat after this time. Many of us now wake up to an alarm, and the problem with this is that there's a good chance that your concentration of melatonin will still be raised at this time. There's also a circadian rhythm in cortisol, produced by your adrenal cortices, and there's a sharp spike in cortisol production shortly before you wake each day. The purpose of this is to mobilize energy reserves and raise blood pressure in anticipation of the day ahead. The problem is that cortisol also worsens insulin sensitivity. So this is one more reason that I suggest that you wait until at least 30 minutes after you naturally wake up before you have your breakfast. Now, whereas the timing of the master clock is mostly set by light exposure, the timing of clocks elsewhere in your body is mostly set by the time at which you eat. And experiments in mice have shown that if you take two groups of mice and you feed one from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and another from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., then within days, the timing of gene expression in organs such as the liver is completely inverted between the groups. But the timing of the master clock barely budges. And recent work has also shown that changes in diet timing only seem to influence the timing of peripheral clocks in humans. This is important because the timing of your peripheral clocks shapes when they are best suited to certain jobs. As an example, clocks in your fat cells have their own intrinsic rhythm in insulin sensitivity, which is highest at about midday. And these fat cells produce a protein hormone named adiponectin, which has insulin sensitizing effects. Sure enough, this has a peak at about midday too. And partly as a result of these changes, insulin sensitivity is highest during the biological daytime. In accordance with this, oral glucose tolerance is about 17% lower in the biological evening than it is in the biological morning. Then there are clocks in your digestive system. For example, your digestive system uses a characteristic pattern of muscular activity to push indigestible food from the stomach to the small intestine. And the speed of this so-called migrating motor complex is more than twice as high during the biological daytime. Then there are cyclical changes in the composition of your gut microbiota. Behaviors such as physical activity, eating, and drinking increase risk of exposure to pathogens, so the circadian system needs to tune aspects of immune function according to time of day, such as the gut microbiota. As a result, it's remarkable how consistently studies have shown that if you expose mice to foodborne or airborne pathogens at the start of when they naturally sleep, they're less likely to survive than if you expose them to the same pathogens during their biological daytime. Final thing I'll mention on this topic is the circadian rhythm in diet-induced thermogenesis, which is the increase in metabolic rate present for several hours after eating. As a result of the circadian system, you'll burn more calories after the exact same meal in the biological morning than you will after the meal in the biological evening. So what I want you to understand is that our bodies are primed for food during our biological daytimes, but if you look at our melatonin profiles, then you'll realize that your biological daytime isn't necessarily my biological daytime. So you should think twice next time you hear someone say something silly like, don't eat after 8 p.m. Now I want to turn to the health consequences of changes in diet timing. And I'm going to begin by looking at studies of other animals. Time-restricted feeding typically entails restricting food access to a period of 12 hours or less each day. And in humans, this is generally referred to as time-restricted eating. Some people conflate this with intermittent fasting, but in my mind, they're distinct. This is important because whereas time-restricted feeding seems to increase the amplitude of circadian rhythms in things like gene expression, fasting tends to flatten those rhythms, and in some instances produces effects that directly oppose those of the circadian system. Now, if you take two groups of fruit flies and give one food access around the clock and another food access for the 12 hours when they normally be active, then they consume an equivalent number of calories. But as they age, the time-restricted feeding group are protected against weight gain, have fewer heart arrhythmias, better muscle function, and sleep better. And all of these changes seem to be associated with improved function of the circadian system. Whereas fruit flies are diurnal, daytime active, mice are nocturnal. And if you give mice the type of high-fat, high-sugar diet that's used to rapidly induce obesity, then their circadian systems function worse, and they spread out their feeding as a result, consuming a greater proportion of their calorie intake during their biological nighttime. As a result of this spreading out of feeding, the 24-hour changes in the composition of the gut microbiota are flattened, and time-restricted feeding can help restore these cycles, and it seems to specifically affect microbes that are associated with metabolic function. Using an 8-hour feeding period, the high-fat diet fed mice on the time-restricted feeding protocol are also protected against weight gain, as well as fatty liver disease. They have lower inflammation, better insulin sensitivity. They even have improved coordination and exercise endurance. And work has now shown that an 8 to 12-hour feeding period buffers against the adverse effects of various obesogenic diets. Other work has also shown that if you use time-restricted feeding for only 5 days each week, then they're similarly protected to if you use it every day of the week. And if this applies to us, then it suggests that we should be able to loosen up a little on the weekends without any ill effects. Finally, there's been some really interesting work showing that, I'm sure you know, that caloric restriction routinely increases longevity in certain animals. But if you use caloric restriction, then animals tend to self-impose time restriction, reduce the amount of food they have available, and they consume it all very quickly. And this raises the question of how many of the benefits of caloric restriction have actually been due to time restriction. That's cool, and makes it seem as if time-restricted eating should be a panacea for us. But what have studies of humans found? A common way to implement time-restricted eating is to skip breakfast. And in this study, more than 300 overweight and obese people were divided into two groups. One consumed breakfast, the other skipped breakfast. Over 16 weeks, although both groups were given advice on how to lose weight, there's no difference between them, and neither group lost a significant amount of weight. But was this an anomaly? Researchers at the University of Bath then did two studies, and in the first study, they looked at healthy, lean, young people. They were divided into two groups. In one condition, the people consumed at least 700 calories by 11 a.m. in the morning, and this was the breakfast group. In the other condition, they were to consume no calories until at least midday, and this was the breakfast skipping group. What they found is that those who skipped breakfast did consume fewer calories, about 500 fewer each day. But they also moved around less. They burned over 400 fewer calories in physical activity. So as a result, there was no change in body weight or fat mass over the course of the study. They looked at various measures of cardiometabolic function. This also didn't change. Sleep wasn't different. The only difference was that those who skipped breakfast had greater blood sugar variability in the afternoon, which isn't a good thing. What about the obese people? They used the same study design, 6 weeks again, and in this instance, they found that those who skipped breakfast burned fewer calories in the morning, but there was no difference over the entire 24-hour period. There was also no difference in how many calories they ate, and again, no difference in cardiometabolic health, sleep, and the only difference that they found was that insulin sensitivity was worse in the afternoon among those who consumed breakfast, among those who skipped breakfast, I beg my pardon. Taken to an extreme, you can look at what happens when somebody consumes a single meal each day. And in this study, they took healthy middle-aged adults and they put them through two 8-week-long conditions. So everybody went through both conditions. In one of them, they had a single large early evening meal, and in the other condition, that was divided into 3 meals each day. So in both instances, they consumed the same number of calories and the same macronutrient composition. Nearly a third of people withdrew, probably because the single meal condition wasn't sustainable. There was no difference in body weight. Those who had the single meal condition felt hungrier, but they did lose more fat mass. They had lower cortisol levels, and they had lower LDL cholesterol levels. But they also had lower HDL cholesterol levels, higher blood pressure, and insulin sensitivity was worse. So all of a sudden, this time-restricted eating stuff doesn't seem so appealing, right? But there's an important wrinkle in the details, and that is the timing of the eating period. I'm just going to return to other animals briefly. If you take two groups of mice and you feed one during 12 hours when they normally be active, and the other during 12 hours when they normally sleep, they again consume an equivalent number of calories, but those who have food access during the sleep period only gain more fat mass. And this seems to be related to misalignment between when they're consuming calories and when they're burning calories. But this isn't all about metabolism. And time-restricted feeding can shift the timing of clocks in skin cells, for example. The timing of these clocks is important to when the skin cells are most sensitive to DNA damage incited by UVB radiation. You probably know that UV radiation is a main determinant of our risk of skin cancer. So if these findings apply to us, it suggests that mistimed eating could even affect our risk of skin cancer. Let's return to humans. Work published last year showed that those who consume a greater proportion of their calories later in their biological days tend to be fatter than those who consume them earlier. This builds on earlier work, and in this study, they randomized women, overweight and obese women, into two groups. In one condition, they consumed 50% of their calories at breakfast, 3 meals each day. In the other condition, they consumed 50% of their calories at dinner. Otherwise, the composition of the diets was the same number of calories, same macronutrient profile. After 12 weeks, those in the late eating group lost 4% of their body weight, which is pretty good. But the early eating group lost 11% of their body weight. At baseline, their waist circumferences were similar. But after 12 weeks, whereas the late eating group lost 3% off their waists, the early eating group lost 8% off their waists. And they also experienced greater improvements in regulation of blood sugar and blood lipids. More recently, work has shown that assigning a smaller proportion of your calories to the dinner meal increases overnight parasympathetic nervous system activity, and that should be conducive to restorative sleep. What about early time-restricted eating? In this study, middle-aged adults, men, with prediabetes who are either overweight or obese went through 2 conditions, each of which lasted 5 weeks. In one condition, they consumed 3 meals each day that was spread into a 12-hour period, and in the other condition, they had the 3 meals over a 6-hour period. Importantly, though, in the 6-hour period, the dinner had to finish by 3 p.m. The meals were identical in both groups. And the 6-hour condition is the early time-restricted eating group. What they found is that after the 5 weeks, the early time-restricted group led to improved insulin sensitivity, reduced oxidative stress, lower appetite, and a whopping 10 millimeter of mercury reduction in morning blood pressure. And to put that into perspective, the size of that effect is comparable to the effect of ACE inhibitors, drugs commonly used to lower blood pressure. One thing I'll add, though, is that there was no difference in body weight between the groups. I don't know about you, but I don't really fancy finishing dinner at 3 p.m. And the men suggested that an 8-hour feeding period or eating period would be more sustainable in the long term. The last thing I'll touch on is the importance of consistency. In one study, a group of healthy young women went through 2 conditions. In one condition, they had a consistent number of 6 meals every day. In the other condition, they had the same macronutrient composition, same number of calories consumed, but they had a varying number of 3 to 9 meals, so on average 6 meals each day. After the consistent condition, the women had higher diet-induced thermogenesis, better blood sugar regulation, and were less hungry. So consistent meal patterns are important too. With all of that said, what are some takeaways that you can use from chrononutrition research in your pursuit of better health? I've already mentioned these 2. In general, I wouldn't recommend an eating period of less than 6 hours each day, and I'd wait 3 to 6 hours between meals. If you're trying to lose fat, for example, and you have to use a very low calorie intake, 1,500 calories, say, then I wouldn't recommend trying to divide that into 5 meals because none of them will be satiating. But if you're a hard-charging athlete and you need to consume 6,000 calories a day to support your exercise training, then don't try and cram that into 2 meals. In general, assigning a large proportion of your calorie intake early in your biological day seems to be good for metabolic health. But exercise produces all sorts of acute metabolic effects that should counter the adverse effects of eating late, such as an increase in non-insulin-dependent glucose uptake. So if you have to train late in your biological day, then don't be afraid to consume much of your calorie intake on either side of the exercise bout. Finally, consistency seems to be important, but it's probably not a problem if occasionally you deviate from your normal pattern. Let's say that you want to try time-restricted eating, but it's important to you to have dinner with your family. In that case, you could skip breakfast, have a large lunch, and then have a moderate-sized dinner. Note that the choice of which meal you skip is likely to affect your food choices. So not many people consume wine at breakfast, and not many people consume cereal at dinner. A lot of this depends on what you're optimizing for. Let's say that you work a very focused and necessarily sedentary office job. You want to wake up as late as possible to make sure you get enough sleep. You roll out of bed, go straight to the office, and are then sat at your desk for the next few hours. Food's a distraction, so just skip breakfast. If you give mice tasty diets, then it disrupts the circadian system. They spread out their feeding, and they're predisposed to metabolic problems. Many of us consume obesogenic diets during the holiday because we've got loads of yummy food around us. So in my mind, this is a prime time to try time-restricted eating. There's also work in mice showing that time-restricted feeding can accelerate ketogenesis. So if you're on a ketogenic diet, then it might be useful for you. And finally, there are probably certain clinical conditions that would benefit from time-restricted eating. And in my mind, the most obvious of these is probably gastrointestinal issues. There hasn't been any work on this yet, to my knowledge. It's not for everybody, though. Who might want to think twice before trying it? People with reproductive issues, people who are trying to gain muscle as fast as possible, people who have very high energy intake, such as athletes, people with very poor blood sugar regulation, and anecdotally, women don't seem to respond as well as men do to time-restricted eating, but there hasn't really been any work on this yet. Okay, finally, what might be some useful future applications of chrononutrition? An important one is how to optimize diet for shift workers, and I suspect that we might be able to use diet to accelerate adaptation to change in light-dark cycles. Various energy sensors can influence the speed at which our biological clocks tick. And if preclinical research on other animals translates to us, then it seems that it might make sense to increase energy intake when flying west and to reduce it when flying east. But there are other data that suggest that restricting calorie intake makes the timing of the master clock in your brain more sensitive to the effects of light exposure on changes in its timing. So in that instance, it would make sense to restrict your calorie intake regardless of the direction of travel. Certain compounds in foods influence the circadian system. Caffeine seems to slow down the clocks in our cells, and if you consume caffeine late in the day, then it tends to delay the timing of melatonin synthesis. This is one more reason to restrict your late-night caffeine intake, but it also suggests that we might be able to use caffeine judiciously when flying west, for example. The final thing I'll mention is that alcohol disrupts many of our body's clocks, so don't be like these idiots. Chrononutrition might also be important to the future of medicine. And a key concept in chronopharmacology is that our body's clocks influence xenobiotic metabolism. So the absorption, the distribution, the metabolism, and the excretion of drugs. Interestingly, the majority of best-selling drugs in the US target genes that are regulated by the circadian system. And this includes all of the top 7 selling drugs. I anticipate that as we better understand the best time at which to take drugs, especially when combined with knowledge of somebody's body clock, chronopharmacology will result in lower doses of medications taken, fewer side effects, and reduced costs. So next time you're prescribed the medication, ask your healthcare practitioner if there's a best time at which to take it. And please note that this is likely true of supplements too. We just don't have good research on many supplements yet. Interestingly, the timing of the body clock influences when drugs are most toxic to other animals. So there have been various experiments on mice administered a drug called acetaminophen, which is a drug that's widely used to relieve pain. And remember how I said diet's important in setting the timing of peripheral clocks, such as that in the liver? Well, if you shift the time at which mice have access to food, then the time at which acetaminophen is most toxic to the mice moves in lockstep with changes in diet timing. And this has important implications for the relationship between eating and taking drugs. And it's probably especially important for drugs with short half-lives. Finally, I think that chrononutrition will be important to the future of personalized nutrition. As an example of this, about 33% of people worldwide have a variant of the MTN-R1B gene, which is one of the melatonin receptor genes, that predisposes them to type 2 diabetes. And this genetic variant seems to amplify the effects of melatonin on our cells. What this probably means is that eating during the biological nighttime is more problematic for those of you who have this variant. So if nothing else, I hope that what you take away is that it's not only what you eat that matters, when you eat is critical too. I work for a company called HumanOS, and we have many resources, including podcasts, blogs, guides, and courses on how to optimize the function of your circadian system and more. And you guys should check it out. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. You want to just mention that Dan's given the subscription to everybody here on the audience for this? I think they just put in Spark code.
Yeah, I think that if you enter the code Spark on the HumanOS website, if you do sign up, then you get a month for $1, those of you who are interested.
Yeah. Humanos.me, right?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay, we had a couple of questions. One was, how do we know what our biological daytime is? You did mention this is kind of different for different people.
Yeah.
How can we find out that?
So the only way that you can accurately find it out is by measuring melatonin. And a common way to do that is measuring a metabolite of melatonin in the urine, which is called 6-sulfur-toxy-melatonin. There's a slight time lag because obviously that's a metabolite of melatonin, so the 6-sulfur-toxy-melatonin profile in the urine is generally a little bit later than what's going on in the blood. So you could do that if you're interested in it. But more practically, you typically find that melatonin offset occurs around the time that you wake up each day, and then what's called dim light melatonin onset. So that sharp spike in melatonin synthesis each evening occurs roughly 2 hours before you go to sleep. So practically, I just think that you should try to minimize your food intake from half an hour after when you naturally wake up until 2 hours before you go to bed.
And does the biological daytime change over your life? Like we have, sometimes teenagers who sleep in, and you have, older people who like to get up in the morning. Does that?
Yeah, it does. It does. So on average, you have newborns who have functional clocks that are poorly synchronized, and then over the first few months of life, they function better. By childhood, people are very early relative to later life. And then as they develop during the teenage years, they reach a peak in lateness around the time of physical maturity. So on average, we go to bed latest and wake up latest at the end of puberty. And then from there, you see people become earlier and earlier over time until around the time of the menopause. And interestingly, there's a sex difference in the timing of our body's clocks too. So on average, women are slightly earlier than men. But that difference between the sexes seems to dissipate by around the time of menopause. And just to add one more layer to that, there's obviously variability between people in what's called our chronotypes, so whether we're morning larks or night owls. So at a given age, obviously, we don't all have the same timing of our body's clock, so there'll be some people who will go to bed a couple of hours later than you, and a few people who will go to bed much earlier.
I read a study that, that one's mental performance is like 20% greater in the morning than versus evening. Is this something you've seen that?
Yeah, there seems to be a circadian influence on various cognitive functions. It depends on the particular cognitive function that you're looking at. So for example, you could look at simple reaction time. You could look at measures of executive function, which is our ability to plan, carry out, and monitor goal-directed behaviors. And it really depends on what you're looking at specifically. Practically, I think that it's useful just trying to understand when you work best. I know for me, I'm a morning person. So I wake up and I try and do my most focused work early in the day. And then as I get more and more tired over the day, I just leave the menial stuff until later. And then also, if I'm feeling worse on some days, then I'll do more simple tasks and I'll try not to do anything which has important consequences when I'm feeling tired or whatever.
I think Daniel Pink talks about this in his latest book. It's on time.
I haven't read it, but yeah.
But okay, that's perfect. Anything else you'd like to talk about? Okay, awesome.